Go ahead and do it.
All right, ready?
Yep.
Going live. You're live.
Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to the shop. This is another live episode of Wood by Wright, which we do every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Central Time. And I'd love to have you come here. We try to pick up odd topics every now and then. And today we're going to be talking about clamps.
Not talking about you tonight.
What?
You said odd topics. We're not talking about you tonight.
Oh yeah, and then occasionally my wife pops in with these humorous things that makes me look good.
Occasionally? Always.
She's the reason you're actually here watching the live. But today we're talking about clamps because, of course, you can never have enough of them, as my father will be the first to tell you. He is the one who taught me most of my woodworking from the time I was like 5 and on up, and like every other time you talk about anything with tools, he talks about clamps because you can't have enough of them. But that's kind of like the story with woodworking. I mean, you know, most tools you just can't have enough of. Except for table saws, at some point you kind of run out of space. But we want to actually go through and do the whole thing on this. So yeah, does anyone? I don't know if you saw if there were any questions ahead of time.
No, but we had a super chat already.
Oh, that's right, we had a super chat. Who was that? Who was it?
I think it was Shawn OBrien.
Shawn, thank you, man. Right off the bat, before we even go live, super chat. So thank you for that. And do you have a mom joke for him?
Yeah.
And this is the thing, if you give a super chat, your question gets bumped up to the very front, as well as you get a mom joke from the queen of mom jokes herself.
Okay, I just made this one up. Ready?
Uh-oh, here it goes.
Do you want to know the difference between nursing and woodworking?
What?
A stool sample.
Don't get those mixed up. If I bring home a stool sample, it's not that big a deal. But if Sarah brings home a stool sample... Ah, yes.
I'm sorry.
So on that note, let's actually go through some clamps. And there are hundreds of types of clamps out there. I have a few selection of them here. There are a lot that I don't have just because I don't use them that much. And in every type and series, there are different sizes and different capabilities. And there are different things that people like. Some people really like one type of clamp over another type of clamp. And basically, you have them in different sizes. You have the clamps that will hold things 1.5 inches or so or smaller. Then you have the things that go from around that 1.5 inches to around 6 inches or so. And then you have some that are like the 6 inches up to around the 2 foot range. And then you have the big ones that go, 2 foot on up. And so in each of those categories, you have different things in there. Like then you have the amount of pressure. You can have clamps that just put a little bit of pressure. And then you can have clamps that you can really crank down and put a ton of pressure on it. And then you have clamps that are really easy. And then you have clamps that aren't quite as easy or intuitive. And in every step, there are all sorts of variations in that. And so let's actually go through some of those. First up, we have the camera's over here. Let's swing back over this way. There we go. We have the spring clamp. And these are, these are the type of thing you don't think you'd use that much. But I have like 50 some of these on hand, and there are times when I would love to have more of them. Some of them you'll actually get, I think it's Rockler that makes them with a band that goes in between that you can actually put bands onto the edge banding for plywood. I don't do a whole lot of that, but it makes it very, very easy. And these are just great. Anytime you have something small to go on, anytime I'm doing epoxy, anytime I'm doing super glue, these come out. And one of the things that I love about these is, let's say you're planing along and you chip out some big chunk accidentally. You can super glue it back on, and usually one of these, put it right back on the board. 5 minutes later, you're back into work. And it's just good to have these on hand because you don't need a lot of clamping force, but they're good for it. Then we can move up to something a little larger. And in the cheaper version, you've got these squeeze clamps, the cheap Irwin things. These don't have a whole lot of clamping force, but I really like them. I use them quite a bit, and anytime I don't really worry about there being a lot of pressure on something, I just want something to squeeze down quickly, this is what I'm going to grab. And I have got a bunch of them. I actually clamp them onto the rafters in my ceiling here. I use them quite a bit, and they're relatively cheap. Then we can go on to C-clamps. And I know a lot of woodworkers are like C-clamps. No, I really don't like C-clamps. For woodworking, they're not that great, but they give you a ton of force. And that's the big difference between squeeze clamps and a C-clamp. As a C-clamp, you've got this leverage out there, and you can really crank down on it. And you can get them in whatever size you want. So C-clamps are actually very useful for woodworking, and I use them quite a bit anytime I really need to squeeze something down. As a matter of fact, I actually have some lamination. I was doing some bent lamination and had a lamination peel up on me. Well, it takes a lot of force to get that back down, and so I put the glue in there and squeezed it down. The C-clamp has all the force I need. So it goes down pretty well. Any questions so far?
Yes, and then I thought another joke. Harman asks, I've been thinking about this one today. How is it that I have two tools made by you and neither one have your stamp?
I don't know what tools you have.
Nothing.
Yeah, all my strops do. So then we can move on to the next style. So if you want something a little bit larger, like a squeeze clamp, but you want more force, you can get an F-style clamp. And I don't have any of those because that's a size that I don't use that much. There may come a point where I'm like, I'd really like to use those, and I'm probably going to go to the store and buy a selection of them. Harbor Freight actually makes some pretty cheap ones that work relatively well. I just haven't had the reason to get it. That in-between size, something that is too large for the hand screw clamp and too small for the beam clamp, I don't do a whole lot in that. So I haven't used a lot of F-style clamps. But those are great for really cranking down. They don't get quite the same amount of pressure as a C-clamp, but you can get them pretty close because you have a handle you can turn and drive it down on there. Then we have some of these, which are a little bit older styles, and you don't see them a lot, but I find myself using them quite a bit. These are when you don't need a ton of pressure, you just need a little bit. And actually, Paul Sellers has a series on making these. These are cam clamps, and so with these, you can put something in here and you can squeeze. Let me grab a block here. Just put this on here. So I can put this in here, and I can very easily and very quickly, as long as I have another hand, slide this down on. Easily and quickly, as you can see here. And I can slide it down on until it holds it in place. And then I can just flip this lever on top, if I can get it in frame. This lever then presses down on and locks it down in place. It's not a crazy amount of force, but it's very quick, it's very easy to put in. And this lever just allows you to very easily adjust it. I can loosen it, I can move it, and I can readjust it. You see these a lot in luthier and instrument making, because you're always clamping things together like the side of a frame on a guitar or things of that nature. And on top of that, they're relatively easy to make. As long as you have a bar to put it in, a couple pins to go through some wood, you can make these in the shop. And again, Paul Sellers has a video on making these. So I have a series of these up in my ceiling, and every now and then I need something where I don't need a lot of pressure, but I need to just quickly clamp it down and hold it in place. If I'm ever putting like a veneer on or something of that nature, these are great for it. A little bit simpler style, this one is actually all wood, and it's the beam coming through here, so this is locked in place in the beam, and this one just slides back and forth, but there's a wedge on the top and the bottom. And with this, when I squeeze it together, I just push it in, and then I squeeze the bottom, and it adds actually squeeze right up here. I always do that. For some reason, I squeeze the bottom. I want to squeeze right up here, right up at the top. And as I move it, it automatically wedges itself back in between these two. So now I actually have a very strong force. And so as strong as I can squeeze is as much force as I can put on here. So it's not incredibly strong, but it's a very quick, very effective way of holding things in place. And so you'll often come across cam clamps and luthier clamps. And I like having them in the shop for little things like that. Any questions yet?
Yes. Okay, so
if you do have any questions, throw them in the chat.
Both questions, but they're from two different people.
Okay.
So Tiny Woodshop asked, do you own any pipe clamps? And then Bryan Fulmer wants to know, are there any disadvantages to pipe clamps?
I'll be getting to pipe clamps a little bit later, because that's like, for some reason, whenever you talk about clamps, pipe clamps are like the clamp. And then that's what takes up. Once we get over here to beam clamps and the longer things, we'll do that. So yes, stay tuned. So then we've got the next thing up for me are hand clamps. And when I used to be all power tools, I had none of these. And it was one of these things I didn't realize what I was missing until I got a few. And now that I have these in my shop, I think I have like 20 of them. My ceiling is full of them. I'm actually going to show you their ceiling because I know a few people are going to be asking that. I've got up here on my ceiling, I've got these clamps up here. And then over on this side, I've got, these are where I put the squeeze clamps and things like that. And then I've got all these hanging up over here. And this is where I put all of my, my beam clamps. So we'll get back into those in a bit. But these are fantastic as long as you know how to use them. And what you do is you keep these two jaws parallel and you hold both of them. Always hold both handles and you run them out and you run them in. And as long as you're holding both handles, these stay parallel. And so you can keep them together and right at parallel. And now you know that these jaws are exactly tight. And when you want to clamp something, actually I should get something to clamp, and that might make this a little bit easier to explain. Grab a stray board. There we go. So, refocus. There we go. So what I can do with this is I want to clamp it down onto something, well, 3/4 inch here. So I can grab these, and I always go the wrong way first, and get to something, that looks pretty close right there. You can put that in, it's a little off, and then I can move both together. So I'm going to move both that way, and now I've got a good tight fit, and I've got clamping pressure running all the way along this face. Then on this back one here, well actually the first thing I'm going to do is this one here, I'm going to clamp this down as much as I can. I'm not going to put too much force on there. I can't put too much force on there because it's so close to the clamping surface. But then this one back here has more leverage. So on this one, I can really squeeze it down. And what this is going to do is it's going to put an incredible amount of force all the way along. And because there's a greater distance between this screw and the fulcrum, I can put a lot of force on here. I mean, with this, I can put hundreds and hundreds of pounds. I've never done that before. I should do that with some of my big ones and see exactly how much. My guess would be somewhere around 800 to 900 PSI with this crank back here. It's incredibly strong. And then when you release it, you just take that little bit off until the board comes loose, and now they're back in a parallel. And so you can run them in and out and hang them on the ceiling. And they're very, very great for that. The other thing where these come out is anytime you need to hold small pieces. If you have power tools and you need to hold small pieces, so you have something small you need into the bandsaw or something you need to drill in the drill press, you can clamp that little piece on here, and now you have a big hand that can go onto it and put it into the tool, so you're keeping your hands away from the power tool. If I'm doing filing on, so if I'm making like a tote handle, I can clamp the tote handle into this and then put this down into my vise. So I can open up the vise, clamp it down, and now I have a raised surface I can work at. I can get my files and I can go all the way around it, and this becomes a great way to hold onto small things. They're not just for clamping, they're an extra hand, and I use them all the time, and I have a pile of them. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. I have 20 of these in the shop, all different sizes, all the way from this little, what is this? This is a, what about 3 or 4 inch, all the way up to the big 12-inch beasts. Some people call these Jorgensen clamps because Jorgensen made more of them than anyone else, and so you can see Jorgensen. But most people refer to them as hand screw clamps, and they come in 2 styles. You have the metal screws. And the thing about these metal screws is that they are cross-threaded. Not cross-threaded, they're double-threaded. And so inside, you have a bar running through, and one side, the bar is right-hand threads, and the other side, it's left-hand threads. So as I move one of these screws, it pulls the 2 jaws together or away. Now, if I go to a wooden hand screw clamp, these are threaded all the way through, and I have a video on making this, so if you want to see that, there's a link to it down below. And so with these, you still run them the same way. You hold them together like this, and you run one end to clamp it down, and you run the other one in to tighten it. They work the exact same way, the exact same function. The difference is that one of them has a sliding jaw, and the other one is a stagnant jaw that is locked in with threads. And so you can see in here, On this one, the top of this is loose, and so it just rides up against this handle. And at the bottom, it has this peg that goes through and spins inside there. So this jaw doesn't move at all. Both of these screws just move this jaw in and out. And so if you think about it that way, this jaw stays put and this jaw moves in and out. It makes more sense. But you still run them the same way, keep both hands on them, and rotate them around, and you clamp them the exact same way. So it's a different way to do it, but these are actually kind of fun because you can make them yourself as long as you get a thread cutter. You can throw together a couple clamps pretty quickly. Any questions there?
No.
No? Cool.
No, you actually, there was a question about the rafters and you panned up before I could even ask. So.
Glad to help. Yeah, I'll talk about clamp storage a little bit more later because that really is a debacle. So now let's actually talk about some other things. You've got your little clamps that go, 1.5 inch, maybe 2 inch. You've got your medium clamps that will go from that 1.5 inch up to maybe 6, maybe 12 inches, depending upon how big of a bar, or if you've got like a big squeeze clamp, this one might get up to, 13 inches, 14 inches? But there are a set of clamps that are then in between these. So they usually go from 6 inches up to around 2 feet-ish. They're usually small bar clamps, or they are large F-clamps, things of that nature. I don't do a lot in that work, so I really don't have anything in that size. Most of the time, if my hand screw clamps can't go up big enough, then I throw on them a bar clamp. And this is actually a bar clamp that I made. And I have a video series on this. I did a collaboration with, oh, come on, I can't remember his name. It'll come to me eventually. It's linked down in the description below. And he made the hardware for it, and I made the wood for him. And I really, really like these things. They're kind of fun and simple, and they are very quick and easy to adjust. You slide it in, and this locks into each one of these places. And then you have this screw that can run in and out. We made these with just a standard bolt thread, but if you use an Acme screw, they would go a little bit faster. And we tried to duplicate old bar clamps. Let me grab one of my old bar clamps.
Yuri Tuxman?
No.
Wasn't Yuri. Okay.
No, it was not Yuri. Wildman Tech, there we are.
Ah.
So this is one of my old bar clamps, and these are over 100-year-old. And so there's just a set of hardware. And originally, when they were made, you would buy the hardware, and then you would make the wooden beam that go with them. I haven't found anyone that makes ones quite like this. These are very, very hard to come by, and anytime I find them, I snag them. I've probably got 20 or so of them, and they're all different styles and sizes and shapes and different handles and things like that. But I absolutely love these things. They're fun to use, they're incredibly strong, and they give you more than enough pressure for most all the woodworking you're going to do. Now, there are a few companies in Europe that make something very similar to this. They're called sash clamps. So if you Google for sash clamp, you'll come across it. But rather than having a piece that slides and then latches into a detent, this has a bolt that goes through the beam. And so in order to move it, you have to take that pin out, slide it to another hole, and then put the pin through it. So it's a little bit more fiddly, but we'll do the same thing. You buy the hardware and you can put the rail on it. Unfortunately, they're very expensive. Especially if you're in the U.S. and you have to pay to ship them over here. And I've been trying to get a set of them, but I haven't been able to yet. And I'd love to do that, but yeah, for now. These used to be very, very common, but they're hard to come by. It's a sash clamp. So this is more the historical long clamp. But nowadays we've got lots of other things. Before I get to the pipe clamp, we're going to talk about the Harbor Freight clamp. And these are dirt cheap. I mean, you can pick them up for almost nothing in comparison to clamps. And they provide a rather heavy amount of pressure in how they work. You can put not quite as much as a C-clamp on there because the beam is a bit flexible. But they work really well. And anytime you need extra clamps, they're here. And I've got, a dozen or so of these. When I was making the table, I needed ones that were slightly longer, and I need more of them in order to clamp together the table, so I bought a bunch of them for that, because you can never have enough clamps. But these are relatively cheap and flimsy. The thing is, they do provide enough strength, and if you go to Paul Sellers, he has a video on stiffening these. He actually puts a wooden beam in here, because these can, here, if you see it this way, you can see that they'll twist. It's just an aluminum beam. but because these two clamps, that was loud, that was really loud. Because these two clamps are trying to be pushed apart, this beam is in tension. And so the aluminum beam, even though it's relatively thin, is more than strong enough. The only problem with it is you get deflection. When it really starts clamping, this beam will actually bend and twist with the pressure. And so because of it, they feel cheap. They are less than ideal. But for the price, you just can't beat them in how functional they are. Now, if you're going to be doing a lot of panel glue-ups, then you're going to want something bigger, stronger, something that's a little more heavy duty. And that's when you get into pipe clamps. And I don't have any pipe clamps. And the reason I don't have any pipe clamps is I've been collecting these over the years, and I love using these. I don't like using pipe clamps. I mean, pipe clamps are just as efficient, they're just as flexible, but they're not as much fun. And this is fun. And so that's why I'm not a big pipe clamp person. Sorry, Dad, you raised me wrong, apparently. If it's my dad's birthday or Christmas, you can always get him pipe clamps. And pipe clamps work great. They're just not my cup of tea. And so, if you want to get them, great. They're far easier to find than these. You can pick them up in any store. And so if you need clamps, that's usually the cheapest way to get together, other than the Harbor Freight clamps. The things with pipe clamps you have to be careful of. With these wooden beam clamps, I can put them right onto the surface, and I don't have any problem with that. I'll add a little bit of paste wax on them, and the glue will peel right off, and I don't have to worry about that. I can put them right on the surface. If I do that with a pipe clamp, especially if I'm using black pipe, I have to be careful because that will leave almost like a marker stripe on the wood that takes a lot to get out. And so if you are going to be doing pipe clamps, it's usually worth it to spend a little bit more to get a galvanized pipe as opposed to a black pipe. Even the galvanized pipe will mark a little bit, but it won't mark nearly as much as the black pipe will. So black pipe is cheaper, but galvanized pipe is usually what I would suggest for that. Though I know there are other people who argue one way or the other. It's just my personal opinion. But yeah, that's the personal opinion of the guy who doesn't have any pipe clamps. So that's that. And this is one that I just got recently, and I am in love with this. It's kind of like the best of both worlds, but this is an incredibly strong clamp here. And I want to show you this. And I want to get some more of these. It's got a simple detent that comes in here, and so you can very quickly and easily move it along. And then this back here has this monster crank on this with an Acme screw. So the amount of pressure I can put with this clamp is off the charts. It wouldn't surprise me if I could get this clamp somewhere around 3/4 ton or more pressure, which is way more than you need. And I'd love to get more of these, but this is the only one I had. I bought it for $10 at the Peach Meet down in Georgia and Florida, just before the pandemic, the last tool meet that I was able to go to. Yeah. Oh, and then I also have these beam clamps that I made a while ago. I don't generally suggest making these, but when I first got going and I needed to make my first bench, I didn't have any clamps. And so I was able to make these for like $4 a piece or less. Here, I'll show you what these are made from. So on this side, I have a U-bolt that comes through here, and that U-bolt just notches into any of these. And that then goes through this block down the bottom. And then here, I've got a stopping block, a big carriage bolt, and so I'd actually just clamp on vice grips to tighten and loosen this, and that then runs forward into this block, and this will slide in and out. And so it's a really simple, dumb design, and I don't use them much. I only use them when I'm out of other clamps. But every now and then they come out because you always need more clamps than you have on hand. So I don't suggest making these, but if you need clamps and you don't have them, go for it. There's lots of other designs out there. So before we get into hanging and maintenance, that type of thing, what questions do we have?
All right. So earlier, Bryan Fulmer says you were mentioning PSI. Do you calculate or eyeball the number of clamps you would need? I eyeball the number of clamps. Usually for an average panel glue up, I put 1 clamp per foot is about what I like with my wooden beam clamps. And that's
And that lets me know that my hand pressure of turning this is about what I need for 1 clamp per foot. Give or take. It's just a good rule of thumb for me. If you are using something with a crank on it, so like on these, I've got this sliding crank. I can put more torque on this than I can on that hand. So I might be able to get away with less of these than with those because I can put more pressure per clamp. But then you're putting more instance pressure and there's a little less pressure in between the clamps. So it depends on how much pressure you put into it. And then it also depends on your glue. If you're using epoxy, you don't need a crazy amount of pressure. With epoxy, as long as it's in contact and bonding, it's golden. You don't need a heavy amount of pressure. If you're using a PVA like Titebond II, Titebond III, you need a lot of pressure. Depending upon the type of wood, you're looking at like, what is it, like 215 PSI, which doesn't sound like a lot. And if you're just using 1 clamp between jaws, that's not that much. But if you're clamping over the width of a board, that's a lot of pressure. And so in order to get that pressure up, you really need to have more clamps on there. Yeah. And so that's where a lot of people start doing sprung joints. And sprung joints are when you take the 2 boards and you put them together. If you get a perfect joint, so as soon as they touch, they're touching along the full length. That's a standard joint. A sprung joint means you take a little bit out of the middle of this. It might be just like 2 or 3 thousandths where this has been carved out and the other side has been carved out. So when they touch, they'll touch at either end, but not in the middle. And the great thing about that is you can put 1 clamp in the middle, squeeze this whole thing together, and you'll get an even pressure running all the way across it as long as your sprung joint is an even curvature all the way around it. And so 1 clamp you can put it together, but you got to have a really, really strong clamp in order to get enough pressure going all the way along, especially with like a PVA. Is that a super chat?
It is a super chat.
Oh, Shawn wants another joke. You got one?
I have another one I made up.
What is it?
What's Yoda's favorite woodworking tool?
What?
A clamp. It uses the force.
Yeah, this is pretty good. I like that one.
Sorry. I'm done with the ones I've made up.
Thanks, Shawn.
Thanks, Shawn.
Yeah, so clamping pressure is one of those things when you read the glue bottle, it says it needs 215 PSI of pressure. That is the optimal pressure. If you go over that, you might lose a little bit of strength. If you go under that, you might lose a little bit of strength. But at 215, it's like the perfect amount of pressure. For 90% of what you do, you don't need the perfect amount of pressure. You just need enough pressure. Because most glue joints, if they're done perfectly, are way stronger than they need to be. You can get away with a lot less. And so measuring that exact amount is nice, but it's not perfect. And that's why I do a lot of just eyeballing it. If I'm, if I'm using my beam clamps, 1 a foot is plenty enough strength. For my table, because it was a 2-inch thick slab, I ended up putting, I think it was a clamp every 8 inches along that. Each one being on opposite sides of the board, because I needed more pressure on that. Yeah, and you can actually get load cells that will tell you how much pressure in it, but you get spending like $200 a load cell to put on each clamp, and I just don't see the use for that. Yeah, it's the other type of clamp you can get if you really want to spend the money. Bessie and Jet make parallel clamps, and so they're a beam where the jaws slide around, but the jaws are much, much taller. And so the nice thing about those is that the beam is stiff enough, so when you put pressure all the way out on the tip of the jaw and the tip of the jaw, usually the whole beam wants to bend. And those jaws then move out of parallel. And so with a parallel clamp, you can get a greater pressure over a longer distance. And so there's a few applications for that, such as dropping them off the side of your bench. If you're clamping a panel, rather than putting the clamp across the panel, you can actually, here, let me show you. Rather than putting it, if you have your panel this way, rather than putting it on this way, with a parallel clamp, you can turn it a little bit and put it this way. And so the face will stick out a little bit farther and will actually clamp along the face rather than across the face. And there's some uses for that. What other questions we got?
Let's see. Harold Golden had asked, how about web clamps or ratchet straps?
Yes, we'll be getting those here in a moment. This, yeah, and if you've seen, actually, let's go ahead and do that. If you saw any of the bent lamination I've been doing, I actually use a big trucking ratchet strap. Was it 3-inch wide band or 2-inch? I think it's a 2-inch wide band. And it's really, really heavy duty ratchet strap. And I've used those actually quite a bit. If you're putting together a panel, you can run these ratchet straps around it and then clamp it down, and those will pull it across. The thing you have to be careful of is the ratcheting is only happening on one side of the board, and so it will be pulling out the tension on that side of the board, so your two boards that are joint will start to tip out like this because you're pulling all your pressure from one side. So you need to make sure you have the slack moved up around so you can get that pressure on there. The one I use quite a bit is actually this thing, and it is for picture frames. Let me show you this. So what this has is I can loosen up these arms. Let me take a loop out of this without dropping it. So I don't want to drop this on the ground. It becomes a pain to fix back up. And so what I can do is loosen up the arm, and I can pull this strap through. And then these blocks, I can put one of them on each corner here. And so each one of these will go around a corner of the picture frame. And then I can use this, and it pulls this whole carriage back, pulling both of these cables. So the problem with a ratchet strap is you're only pulling on one side. Because this is pulling both this cable and this cable, it's doing a little bit better job of going all the way around. And so I can get them tight and close, lock it down, and then really crank it out. So anytime I'm doing a picture frame, these are incredibly useful. And yeah, picture frames, small boxes, anything with 4 corners mitered, this is it's a phenomenal thing to have on hand. Yeah, I actually haven't used web straps much, so wouldn't be the best one on that. But yeah, I have used ratchet straps quite a bit, especially for any of the lamination bending or anytime where I'm pulling something together. They work great. The bigger ones, you can put a crazy amount of pressure on with that. But this one's from Wolfcraft. I want to say it was like 15, 20 bucks. I've used it quite a bit, and every time I use it, it's a lifesaver because it makes it so easy because you can connect all 4 corners, and with one motion you can tighten them all down. And if you ever tried to glue up miters using beam clamps, you have one on each side, and each time you tighten one up, it squeezes the other ones out. With this, you're actually just squeezing them all together, so you're getting even pressure. Then you get it close to the pressure you want, and then you have a little bit of wiggle room. You can move them around and get all the miters exactly where you want them, and then give it that last little bit of cranking to tighten it up. And it's fantastic. What else we got?
Okay, so just because you won't read this till later, the poor man said, since the majority of your clamps are above your head, does that mean you're technically under pressure?
Thanks, man.
All right, so Shawn OBrien asked for you to discuss something, and since he super chatted, I'm going to bump it up.
Of course.
So he wants you to talk about panel clamping and cauls. C-A-U-L-S?
Yeah.
Okay.
Gotta talk about that. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. It's a great one. So basically, let me go through, grab some things to explain this. Here we go. Let's imagine for a moment we want to glue these 2 boards together and make a panel. What you've got is the 2 boards come together, and I have a clamp that comes across. Let me just go ahead and do this. We got a clamp that comes across this way and squeezes them together. And great, they're squeezed, they're pushed together. They're squeezed together. But, oh no, our surface isn't flat. This one's a little higher than this one. And so I come in here with a mallet and I tap this one down, and then over here it's a little bit different. And so I'm kind of wiggling it back and forth, trying to get these 2 perfectly flush, and it becomes a pain. And so what you can do is you can get 2 more boards and make cauls. Let me grab something here. This, and I don't have anything else quite like that around here. So I can put a board on here like this, and then put another one underneath it, and then I can put clamps on and squeeze these together. And so that will... I'm sorry about that. Oh, got some dust in here. Woo! That was a good one. COVID! Okay,
we're socially distanced.
Yes, it doesn't go through cameras, I hope. Who knows? So cauls, you can actually put them in here and it will clamp the whole thing together. And if you're doing a panel clamp with multiples, so you have a seam here, another seam here, another seam here, this makes it very good because I can actually get longer reaching clamps to reach in there and squeeze these together. As well as sometimes I'm going to be putting clamps down here on the end of the joint, holding that together there. Now you can actually get clamps, and I'm trying to remember, yeah, Lee Valley makes them, and I can't remember what they're called, but they're kind of like a beam clamp and a caul clamp all in one. And so you have two cauls that go on either side of the board, and then in the end you have two traveling stops that push the board together. But as they push the board together, the beams naturally want to bend in. And so because they bend in, they're naturally squeezing the panel together. And so it's kind of like all in one to have your clamps, your clamps and cauls in one clamp. And I can't remember what they're called. It's one of these things in the back of my brain that I've never had the projects like, yes, I want those. Anytime you're gluing together a bunch of small pieces, they would be phenomenal for that. But I've never actually gotten to the point where I want to actually go out and buy them. Although it would make a good video because they sell it in a kit where you can get the hardware and then you make the boards that go into it. Shannon Rogers actually has a video on making some of those too. Cauls. Yeah. So I don't do a lot with cauls. And the reason I don't is that is kind of one of the differences between having a thickness planer and hand planes, is if you have a thickness planer, you thickness all your boards ahead of time and then you glue them together. And the problem with that is you need to make sure that those are perfect so that there isn't any difference in the seam. And having cauls really helps that out. It stops boards from sliding. It makes it much easier to clamp things together and get things right where you want them. And that's where biscuits come in, is biscuits will keep the boards from sliding, or dowels will keep the boards from sliding. Biscuits and dowels actually make the joint weaker. They do not make it stronger because there isn't any clamp on the biscuit to hold it in. Yes, the biscuit swells a little bit, but it doesn't add enough pressure to make it a good, strong joint. And if you've ever broken one, you'll notice that the biscuit breaks off inside the joint. Biscuits and dowels are there to help align the boards. They are not there to add any strength to the joint. And so with a thickness planer, you thickness all your boards and then you glue them up, and you want to make sure that they're perfect. With hand planes, usually you glue the boards together and then you flatten it all in one big piece. And so if you're using hand planes, there really isn't a whole lot of use for cauls. If they're out a little ways, oh well, I'm going to be flattening the whole piece. It really doesn't take that much more. If I am, then I'm still going to be taking a card scraper to it and smoothing them out. So any small variation, it's actually rather quick for me to address it and scrape them out. And so I don't use cauls much because I really haven't had a need. Most of the time I'm going to be flattening it afterwards. Anytime you see me doing like drawer bottoms or things like that, it's probably about the only time I have two plane surfaces on one side and two rough surfaces on the other side. So when those two plane surfaces come together, I try and match those up. But then I'm going to come in through with a card scraper and clean out the glue out and fix up any wobbly disjointednesses. What questions we got?
Oh, we've had a couple along the lines of this question. So Brian Benson asked, what clamps would you recommend a new woodworker purchase and or build? He has one screw clamp about 4 inches and several Irwin clamps from the big box store.
I'm going to tell you, don't buy any clamps unless you need them. Now, that being said, you will always need them because you never have the right clamps. But buy the clamps for the project rather than having the clamps in case you do the project. You'll see the project coming up ahead of time and you're like, ooh, I've got that panel glue up and I don't have enough beam clamps for it. Let me go buy some. And if you're buying clamps because you might need them, then you're using up space before you need it, and you're just getting things because you'd like to get them. And sometimes it's good to just buy things because you want to get them. I mean, isn't that why we buy flowers for our wives? Oh, stink! I just dug myself into a hole, didn't I?
I will never turn down flowers. You know that.
But if you see a project coming up, then you will have an idea of what clamps you need to get for that project, and then the next time you'll have those on hand. And the next project that comes up, you're going to need a slightly different set of clamps, and you'll go buy those clamps. And so usually I'm going to tell people, don't buy them because you're a new woodworker trying to collect all the tools. Buy them because you need them for a particular project that you're working on. And that's usually the suggestion I'm going to give people for most tools other than the basic kit. That's the way I go. And that's why I don't actually list clamps in my beginner's tool set, because clamps are individual depending upon what project you're going to be getting, what project you're needing, and what you're wanting to build. What's next?
Question, does James actually buy flowers? Yes, he does. He's a good man and he knows better.
Well, it's been a little while, so I should get some of here too.
You know I will never complain about flowers. Roses, to be specific. But
pink roses or white.
Anything that dries cool. I like to dry roses. Anyways.
Yes, our house is covered in dried roses.
What can I say? Dad Gamet had a question. Do you use right angle or corner clamps, manufactured or shop made?
No, actually I don't use right angle or corner clamps. And the reason being is most of the time those are for if you're doing butt joints, or if you are putting screws in, or you're doing dowels, where you need to hold it together and then do your joinery. And so I don't have a whole lot of use for those. Some people will use them for frame or box glue-ups, but if I'm going to be doing that, I'm actually going to use, a frame clamp. So I don't actually have any actually, do I have? No, I don't have the corner clamp anymore. I had one small one that maybe I do. No, I don't think I have that one anymore. But I don't have any use for them because most of the time my joinery is done like a dovetail, or something that is a functional joint, and so when I put the pieces together, they hold themselves in place, and then I can I clamp up the box or whatever. So I don't use a lot of corner clamps. It's just a personal style. I don't use a lot. I don't use any. So. Okay. Next question I'm going to get a lot is how do you keep?
Hang on.
What's that?
Hang on.
I'm hanging.
Shawn OBrien super chatted.
Shawn, my man, thank you.
Well, no, it was for me.
Oh, for Sarah.
Do you not see the rose?
Oh, there's a rose. Yes, I see the rose thing. Wait, Shawn, are you buying roses for my wife?
Well, you have. No. Okay, hang on. I got a good one. I got it.
She, in her free time, collects the best jokes. She does a good job of it. I'm waiting.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, phosphorus, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. So ask me.
Why phosphorus?
Because it's the elemental P.
I love you, babe.
That's my science joke.
One of the most common questions I get when I look at clamps, and particularly,
how did you get such an amazing wife? Oh, with
yes.
clamps.
Particularly when I talk about beam clamps, pipe clamps, and pole clamps, is how do you keep the glue from sticking them? So if you've got a panel that is on here and you've got the glue seam running across and the glue drips out, how do you keep the glue from sticking to the clamp? That's easy. I use paste wax. I use my, where'd it go? Oh, here it is. This block of wax. And every now and then I'm going to grab my clamp and I'm going to do this. And just like that, no glue is sticking to this. It is a fantastic, fantastic fix. And I'll do that with the wooden ones. I'll do that with the aluminum ones. And just that little bit of wax on there will stop glue from adhering to it. You don't need to mess with it anymore. And the nice thing about it is you got wax on there, so the end pieces, especially on the metal ones, they'll slide in that bar much easier. And if you've got the really expensive, Bessie parallel, the Jet parallel clamps, you get any glue on that at all, and the slide it's a pain to move that thing up and down. Put some wax on it, and you will keep it glue free. It'll move much, much easier. You just do it once a year or so, or how often you glue a major glue up, a little bit of wax, and nothing sticks to it. Epoxy, wood glue, it's fantastic. I love that stuff. And even like, my wooden clamps, they're held tight up against the panel, and they don't stick to it at all. Just take it off and good to go. So wax. And yes, I do even put wax on the threads of my hand screw clamps. I'll put wax on the metal ones as well, because a lot of times you'll have glue dripping out and coming onto the threads. And if I get glue that drips out onto the threads, then now I have a clamp that doesn't work. Putting a little bit of wax on there makes it work great. And then, of course, the screw itself actually works even better.
Okay,
so
so
wax. What?
WB Fine Woodworking just asked, what wax are you using?
I have a video on, it's actually, if you search for Wood by Wright, how to make wax, I'll have a video on making wax. And this is my hard wax. And so this is 2 parts beeswax to 1 part linseed oil. And I believe in this one I use raw linseed oil. Most of my tool lubrication I use raw linseed oil. But basically any wax, any oil, make it into a slightly harder consistency. And I keep this block around. This is what I what I wax my planes and saws with. So I'll put a little bit on there to keep lubrication and keep them going. It also acts as a bit of rust protectant with the oil in there. So it keeps things from that. So it's amazing what a bit of paste wax will do.
And occasionally he just goes like this.
Yeah, it works really, really well for this. Extra buffing the shine. Get that glare every now and then the light bounces off. Yeah, people struggle with glue on their clamp regularly. And it's one of those things that kind of surprises me because it's something that's very, very easily fixed. Just rub a little bit of wax on it. And even if you don't want to make your own, well, this isn't actually Johnson paste wax. Or no, this one's Minwax paste wax. But you can get this and do the exact same thing. It's actually a little bit looser. So this is my thin wax, and it's 3 parts oil to 2 parts wax, I think it was. And I added a little bit of thinner to this. I think turpentine was the thinner on this one. But you can just keep like a steel wool rag in here and then use that to wipe down your clamps. So even just the store-bought paste wax will do the same thing. So, yeah, a little bit of wax, and you'll have no problem with rust. You'll have good functioning tools. Glue won't stick to it. I mean, it's the best of both worlds. That's the same thing I do with my bench top. It regularly has a coat of paste wax or linseed oil or whatever last finish was on there. And glue does not stick to it when it drips in there. So if I have glue that drips onto the table, I don't clean up the glue and wipe it away. I let it harden, and then I just pop it off, and it's good to go. That way I'm not smearing it all over the place, because I hate whenever you have glue on the joint. A lot of people will come through after they glue the joint and come through with a wet rag and wipe it off. I don't generally do that. Unless like there's a drip running across the board, I'm going to let the glue pile up because it's easier to wipe it off. It's easier to scrape it off. But again, it's a personal preference. So sorry, rabbit trail. What's the next question?
Let's see. mystang89 said, how much pressure is too much? I was told rule of thumb is to stop when you see the glue squeeze out.
There is actually an odd myth that you can starve a joint by squeezing it too much. And for 99% of the glues out there, that is impossible. You cannot over squeeze the joint. You might lose a little bit of strength, but not enough to make any difference or anything that's noticeable. So over cranking the joint is generally not a problem. The only time it's a problem is if you're working with an incredibly dense South African wood or something from Australia, where it's basically like gluing steel together. In that case, yes, you possibly could squeeze all the glue out. But especially when you're working with like a Titebond or any PVA glue, you can't squeeze it out. It needs the pressure to work. If you don't get a good, heavy, strong pressure on there, it won't hold full strength. And so just because glue is squeezing out doesn't mean you've fully squeezed it down. If you have a lot of glue in there, you'd need to squeeze all that glue out so you get a nice bond from wood to wood. Now, if you're using epoxy, there's a little bit better chance you can squeeze out the glue and have a weaker joint. Because with epoxy, you don't need that clamping force. It just needs to be together. And so with epoxy, as long as the wood touches and is copacetic, you've got a good joint between it, you don't need to squeeze anymore with epoxy. But with PVAs, Titebond II, Titebond III, you really got to crank those down. And so there is actually a myth on squeeze out. Who was it? There was a channel. Man, I can't remember. I'm thinking it was in Canada, but I can't remember who. He actually did a test where he cranked down boards, and they're supposed to be glued down to like 200 something psi, and he cranked them down to 200, 400, 600, over 1,000 psi, and to the point he's just like crushing the board. And come to find out, the glue is just about as strong at every one of those, so you can't over crank it. If you're crushing your board, then you're probably squeezing too hard, because then you're damaging your work. But don't worry about
Wendell.
that. Matthias Window, there we go. That was. And I haven't seen. I gotta look him up again. I haven't seen him in a while. So don't worry about squeezing out your PVAs. If it's epoxy, maybe think about that. But that's the big thing. What's next?
Okay, so DBaca Maker had a follow-up question to that. In the case of exotic woods, wouldn't you add some roughness to the joint to keep the glue in place?
Some people will add salt to it, and there's a big debate on that. I haven't seen an actual study done on does salt affect the joint. The salt will cause things not to move around, but salt doesn't actually give it a space to be, and so I don't really see a huge benefit with salt other than it stops the boards from moving so that they don't slip on you while you're in clamp up. Usually, if you're going to be doing a hardwood, like a really dense South American or Australian hardwood, usually I'm going to sand them with like a 100 grit sandpaper, get a decent rough surface, maybe an 80 grit sandpaper, and so there is that texture between them. So when you do clamp them together, that texture is still pushing them apart, and so there's still space for the glue to be. But the most important thing with most of those is to clean them off, either with an alcohol or an acetone or something like that, because there are a lot of natural oils in the wood, and those natural oils, if they're sitting on the outside, will impede the glue from adhering to the wood. So rough it up and then clean the joint off so you get good clean wood bond, and then clamp it together and crank the snot out of it.
Yeah.
What's next?
All right. I have question. Tiny Woodshop asks, what about Kreg style clamps?
Kreg style clamps? I don't know Kreg style clamps. Because you think of like Kreg jigs are for like pocket holes and things of that nature. I know what you're talking about, like the vice grip clamps. So they've got the vice grip mechanism, but rather than just having a jaw that grabs a bolt, they're two big arms that come out and pinch. Those are great. I used to use quite a bit of that, but I don't have them anymore. We use them a lot for theater work, where we need to like take this piece and attach it here, and we clamp it on, and then we can put our screw in and hold it. And so it's a good, quick, temporary clamp that holds really, really well. And so you'll see those a lot for Kreg jigs or pocket holes, where they can hold the two boards together while you screw them in. I don't use them much because most of the time they're used in the same way that you use corner or 90-degree clamps, is they hold something together while you put the joinery into it. And most of the time I'm putting the joinery on the boards and then connecting them together. So I don't use those that much. In most cases where I need something like that, I'm going to be using a spring clamp because it's just a little faster and easier. But they do have a lot of good applications. There's not one that I use that much. But yeah, thank you for that. I forgot about those. Then you'll also see a lot of others. Bessie makes these welding clamps that I absolutely love. They're basically, if you imagine a big piece of steel L, and then you have this sliding bar that runs on the L. And so you can slide it down on. Either there's an F-style screw clamp, or there'll be a lever clamp. And they're very, very fast because you can just slide the arm down on, much like you would have with this, where you can slide the arm. But they're all out of steel and have an incredible amount of clamping force. We used to use those for the welding shop I worked at. But again, don't have much use for those here. And all the clamps I've mentioned, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more that I have not mentioned, because there are so many different types of clamps for so many different types of applications, and don't feel like you need them all. Eventually you'll want them all, but that's normal. What's next? We got about 5 minutes left.
All right.
So we'll see how many we can get to.
Let's see. Harold Golden asked, how long do you leave the clamps on when using Titebond II?
If it's a panel glue up, I usually leave it on overnight because I've glued it up and I'll set it aside and come back. If I'm pressed for time,
No
and
pun
I
intended.
know, what's that?
No pun intended. Press. Never mind.
I love you, babe. If I'm pressed for time and I know that the joint doesn't have any internal pressure, in other words, I push the two pieces together and I'm not like forcing them into shape, so I know that they're okay. After 20 to 30 minutes, then I'll take the clamp off and do something else. I just understand that it's still kind of delicate, and so I don't want to push on it or move things around. But for most applications, that's about all you need. Tools for Working Wood sells a glue called 4/4, so 4/4. And that is kind of the industrial glue. It's designed for, you put it together and 20 minutes later you take the clamps off. It's pretty well good to go. I mean, it's still a little bit delicate, but it's a very quick setting, good glue for that. But for Titebond II, Titebond III, I'm gonna usually leave it overnight before I mess with it. And then epoxy, it depends on the type of epoxy you have. But yeah. Cool, what's next?
Let's see. Okay, so these ones are not 100% about clamps, but they're all I have left.
Cool.
So, if there's new ones, sorry, we're just gonna end with these two. Perez Hernandez says, "Hi, question: is it possible to make a screw box out of an old file?"
A screw box out of an old file. Sure. I mean, I'm assuming you're talking about shaping the old file into the cutter for it. In that case, yeah, the old files are fantastic for it. It's good steel for it. You're going to need to anneal it first. So in other words, heat it up until it's no longer magnetic, and then let it cool very, very, very slowly, either putting it in some vermiculite or putting it in insulation or something of that nature that allows it to release its heat very, very slowly. And the slower you can get it to release the heat, the softer the steel will get. And you can reshape that steel and get it exactly what you want. And then you can harden it again by heating it up and then either dunking it in oil or water, depending upon the type of steel, if you know what it is. And then you can temper it, and then go back to where you were. But yeah, that's good steel for that. And I have a couple of videos where I've actually used files to make the iron.
And last question from Big Brother. Do you pre-treat mating surfaces in oily woods, or do modern glues overcome the problem?
It's very rare that I do pre-treat them. I don't use a lot of oily woods, but if you're using things like ipe or teak or some of the South African woods that are naturally oily, then I'll hit them with a bit of acetone or one of the other thinners to clean them out. Acetone or alcohol do pretty well. And you'll clean off the oil with that, and then you get a good bond. Especially if you're using PVAs, that's pretty, it's a good thing to do. Is it necessary? No. It's just a good plan, because you never know what is actually in the surface. Now, if you're using epoxies, it's not quite as necessary. Epoxies tend to get through things like that, and they hold on to far more than PVAs do, because you don't need that clamping pressure. They work pretty well. So yeah, I don't do a lot with them though. So yeah, cool. I think that will about do it, unless I forget anything.
Oh.
Thank you for the fun night. This has been a good bit of time. And if you have any ideas for other videos, let me know. Otherwise, we'll be back next Tuesday, 8 p.m. Central Time. And until next time, Have a wonderful day.
Bye.